The fog had thinned to a pale gauze by the time the carriage stopped at the corner of Montague Street, and the man who stepped out of it did not yet know that Sherlock Holmes already knew his name. He had given no card. He had sent no telegram. He had told no one of his journey from Ipswich, not even the woman who shared his house. And yet, when Mrs. Hudson opened the door to him at 9:20 on that Tuesday morning in October of 1894, a voice from the upstairs landing called down quite mildly, as if continuing a conversation begun long before, "Show Mr. Ashbridge up, please, and bring the second cup." The man on the threshold did not move for a full second. He had a long, narrow face, the kind that looked as though it had been worn thin by careful thought, and his hat was held against his chest with both hands. He looked up the staircase, and then back at Mrs. Hudson, and then up the staircase again. His mouth opened and closed. "I do not believe," he said at last, in a voice gone slightly hoarse, "that I gave my name." Mrs. Hudson, who had long since stopped being surprised by what happened in her own hallway, simply gestured him toward the stairs. "I'll be honest with you for a moment before we continue. The channel hasn't been doing well lately, and at this stage your support genuinely matters. If you're enjoying these mystery stories, take a second to like, comment, or share it with someone who would watch this kind of content. It helps more than you think. And now let us return to the man climbing the stairs of 221B Baker Street, because what happened in the next 4 minutes inside that sitting room would prove to be one of the strangest opening exchanges Dr. Watson ever recorded, and the truth behind it would not surface for another 9 days. I had been at the window when the carriage arrived. Holmes had been at the mantelpiece, reading a letter, and he had read it 3 times, which was unusual for him. He read most things once. He looked up only when the bell rang downstairs, and even then he did not move toward the door. He merely folded the letter, placed it inside a book on the shelf, and returned to his chair with the slow economy of a man who had already decided how the next half hour would unfold. "You expected him?" I said. "I expected someone," Holmes replied. "Ashbridge was one of 3 possibilities. He is, however, the most interesting of the 3, and therefore the one I quietly hoped for." "And his name?" "His name was on the letter." "What letter?" But the door had opened by then, and Mr. Ashbridge stepped into our sitting room with the careful tread of a man who suspected the floor might give way beneath him. He was tall, perhaps 52, with iron-grey hair brushed flat against a high forehead, and his suit was the suit of a country professional rather than a London one. Good cloth, slightly old-fashioned cut, the elbows softened by use. He carried no stick. He had no companion. He looked at Holmes with the bewildered intensity of a man trying to recognize a face he had never seen. "Mr. Holmes," he said. "Mr. Ashbridge, please sit. The fire is rather better on that side." Ashbridge sat. His hands, I noticed, were unsteady. They were not the hands of a frightened man. They were the hands of a man who had been frightened for so long that his body had forgotten how to be otherwise. "How," he said, "did you know my name?" Holmes did not answer at once. He poured tea. He passed the cup. He waited until Ashbridge had taken it before he spoke, and even then he spoke as though he were observing rather than addressing. "You have come about your brother." The cup stopped halfway to Ashbridge's mouth. He did not blink. He did not breathe. For perhaps 3 seconds the only sound in the room was the small wet sound of tea settling against porcelain. "I have no brother," he said. "You had one," Holmes replied. "His name was Edmund. He drowned, or was said to have drowned, in the summer of 1872, in the mill pond behind your father's house at Walberswick on the Suffolk coast. He was 19 years old. You were 21. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. The coffin was closed at the funeral, ostensibly because of the condition of the body after 2 days in warm water. Your father died 8 years later. Your mother followed in 1886. You have lived alone, except for your housekeeper, in the same house for these past 8 years. You have not married. You have not travelled. You have not until this morning ventured beyond the boundaries of Suffolk in 7 years. You have come now because 3 weeks ago you began to receive letters from a man who claims to be Edmund. And last Friday you received a fourth letter that contained a detail no one but your brother could possibly have known. Ashbridge set the cup down. The saucer rattled once and then went still. "How?" he said again, and this time the word was barely audible. "The letter on the mantelpiece," Holmes said, "is from your housekeeper, Mrs. Pollard. She wrote to me 4 days ago. She has served your family for 31 years. She is afraid for you. She believes you are going to do something foolish, and she does not wish to lose another of her boys." It was, I think, the word boys that broke him. He bent forward in the chair and pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes, and for a long moment he did not weep, but rather held something, held it the way a man holds a load that has been on his shoulders so long he no longer remembers what it is to set it down. When he looked up again, his face was perfectly composed. "What detail?" he said. "I beg your pardon. You said the fourth letter contained a detail no one but Edmund could have known. What detail?" Holmes regarded him for a long moment. "That, Mr. Ashbridge, is the question I have brought you here to answer. Now I must pause briefly and ask you to stay with the story. What follows is not a tale of ghosts. It is not a tale of resurrection. It is a tale about a family that arranged, in the summer of 1872, to bury something that was not, in fact, in the coffin, and about a man who lived for 22 years believing himself to be the only person who knew this, and who discovered in the autumn of 1894 that he had been wrong. If you are the kind of listener who enjoys watching a careful man's certainty dismantled piece by piece, I think you will find the next hour worth your while." Ashbridge had brought the letters with him. There were 4 of them, all written in the same careful copperplate hand, on cheap paper of the sort sold in any stationer's in any town in England, and all postmarked from different towns: Norwich, Cambridge, Saffron Walden, and finally Ipswich itself. The first 3 letters were short. They each contained a single sentence. "I remember the boat. I remember the boat and what was in it. I remember the boat and what was in it, and what your father did with the rope." Holmes laid these on the table in order and studied them for some time without speaking. Then he picked up the 4th letter, which was longer, and read it twice, slowly, before he passed it across to me. It said this: "Brother, I have waited a long time to write to you in full, but I find I can wait no longer. I am not a ghost. I am not a dream. I am a living man, and I have been a living man these 22 years, and I have followed your life from a careful distance because I did not wish, until now, to be the cause of further harm to you. But there is a matter that must be settled between us before I die, which will be soon. You know what was in the boat. You know what our father did. You know who I went away with that night, and you know why. I ask only this. Meet me at the old boathouse on the 17th of this month, at 3 in the afternoon. Come alone. If you do not come, the matter will be settled all the same, but it will be settled by other hands than mine, and you will not like the manner of it. Edmund." I read it twice myself before I looked up. Holmes was watching Ashbridge. "3 questions, Mr. Ashbridge," he said, "and I require honest answers if I am to help you. First, was there a boat? Yes. Second, was Edmund in it?" Ashbridge was silent for a long time. "He was in it when it left the shore," he said at last. "Third, what did your father do with the rope?" There Ashbridge stood up. He went to the window. He stood with his back to us for nearly a full minute, and when he turned around again, his face had aged perhaps 5 years. "My father," he said, "did nothing with any rope. There was no rope. That is the lie in the letters. Whoever is writing them does not know what actually happened that night. He knows enough to frighten me. He does not know enough to be Edmund." Holmes leaned forward. "Then who," he said, "knows enough to frighten you, and not enough to be your brother?" And there in that question the case began. There is a particular silence that descends on a man when he is about to tell of truth he has carried for 22 years, and Ashbridge sat in it for perhaps half a minute before he began. I have heard that silence before, in consulting rooms and at deathbeds, and once in a courtroom, and it is always the same. The silence of someone listening, one last time, to the version of his life he is about to lose. "My brother did not drown," he said. "My brother went away. He went away willingly, and with my help, and with my father's help, and with the knowledge of one other person who is now dead. We told the world he had drowned because the alternative would have destroyed him, and us, and a young woman who deserved no part of any of it. We buried an empty coffin. My father weighted it with stones and sand from the pond. The undertaker was a friend of the family who asked no questions. My mother never knew. She lived 14 years believing her younger son had drowned. I have lived 22 years carrying that lie, and until 3 weeks ago I believed I would carry it into my own grave." "What had your brother done," Holmes asked, "that required so elaborate a death?" Ashbridge looked at the fire. "He had not done anything," he said. "That is the part that has been the hardest. He had done nothing wrong. He had only become something that in 1872, in our family, in our county, in our father's house, could not be permitted to exist. I will not here write out the entire conversation that followed, because much of it has no bearing on what happened later, and because some of it was the kind of thing a man says only once in his life, and ought not to be repeated. What is necessary to know is this. Edmund Ashbridge, at 19, had formed an attachment to another young man, the son of a tenant farmer on the neighboring estate, and the attachment had been discovered by their father in circumstances that left no room for any other interpretation. The father, who was a magistrate and a church warden, and a man whose entire view of himself depended on his standing in the county, had locked Edmund in his bedroom for 3 days while he decided what to do. On the 4th night, he had unlocked the door, and the 3 of them, father, elder brother, and the younger son, had walked down to the boathouse in the dark. The plan had been the father's. The boat had been waiting. The other young man had been waiting in it, with 2 trunks and a sum of money sufficient to begin a life elsewhere. The 2 of them had rowed out to a ship that lay at anchor off the coast, a coastal trader bound for Antwerp, whose captain had been paid handsomely to ask no questions, and from Antwerp the father had arranged passage to Buenos Aires, and from Buenos Aires onward into whatever life the 2 young men could make for themselves. They had been told, both of them, that they were to consider themselves dead. They were never to write, they were never to return, they were never, under any circumstances, to make contact with the family in England, because to do so would expose all of them, and would also expose the father's part in arranging their flight, which, if discovered, would have ended his career and possibly his liberty. And he never wrote, Holmes said. Never. Not in 22 years. Until now. Until now. Until now. Holmes was silent for a while. Then he said, "Mr. Ashbridge, I must ask you to consider something very carefully. Is it possible that the letters are from Edmund?" "No." "You answer quickly." "I answer with certainty." "Why?" "Because of one detail," Ashbridge said, "and I will tell you what it is. The night we walked down to the boathouse, my brother was wearing a coat that had been mine. His own had been torn during the 3 days he was locked in the room, and my mother had not been allowed to mend it, so he wore mine. In the pocket of that coat, without my knowledge, was a watch, a small silver watch that had belonged to my grandfather, which I had carried since I was 16. I did not realize until the next morning that I had given it away with the coat. By then it was too late. Edmund had it with him on the ship. He had it with him in Antwerp. He has it, presumably, wherever he is now, or wherever he died if he is dead. No one in the world knows about that watch except Edmund and myself. Not my father, not my mother, not the young man who went with him. No one. If the letters were from Edmund, the watch would have been mentioned. It has not been mentioned, therefore the letters are not from Edmund." There was a long pause. "That," said Holmes, "is one of the most carefully constructed certainties I have ever heard. And I am afraid, Mr. Ashbridge, that it may also be wrong. I would like to take a moment here to invite you, if you are still with us, to settle in. The case from this point forward becomes a matter not of who is writing the letters, but of why a man who has not been heard from in 22 years would choose, now, to allow himself to be heard, and what he wishes to say, and to whom, and at what cost. If you find yourself absorbed by the story, a quiet comment or a like would be a real help to a small channel like this one. Now let us continue." Holmes spent the rest of that morning in close examination of the 4 letters. He examined them under his lens, against the light of the window, and finally against a candle he asked Mrs. Hudson to bring up despite the hour. He examined the postmarks. He examined the ink. He examined the watermarks of the paper. He examined the way the words boat and rope and brother were formed and how they differed from the words waited and settled and die. At the end of 2 hours he stood up, brushed the ash of his pipe from his sleeve, and announced that we would be travelling to Suffolk on the afternoon train. "All 3 of us," he said. Mr. Ashbridge, I should be obliged if you would arrange rooms for Watson and myself at the village inn at Walberswick. I do not wish to stay in your house. I wish, however, to call upon your housekeeper this evening, and upon you tomorrow morning, and upon the boathouse tomorrow afternoon. By the 17th, which is, I observe, the day after tomorrow, I expect to know who is writing the letters and why. Whether we shall also know what is to be done about it is a separate question." Ashbridge did not protest. I think by then he had passed the point of protest. He gave us the address of the inn and the name of a fly we could hire from the station at Ipswich, and he left us at 11:30 with the slightly dazed look of a man who has been carrying water uphill for many years and has just been told he may set the bucket down for a moment. When he had gone, Holmes stood at the window for a long time, watching the carriage retreat down Baker Street. "Watson," he said at last, "what did you make of him?" "A decent man," I said, "frightened, tired. And the story?" "True, I should say." "In what particular?" I considered. "In every particular. He had no reason to invent it. The detail of the watch, that has the quality of a real memory, and the description of the father and the boathouse and the trader bound for Antwerp, none of it had the shape of fabrication." "I agree," Holmes said. "I believe him entirely. Which is, of course, the difficulty." "Why a difficulty?" "Why a difficulty? Because if he is telling the truth, then someone else is telling a version of the truth that overlaps with his, and the overlap is too precise to be coincidence and too imprecise to be the brother. Someone, Watson, knows about the boat. Someone knows about what was, in a manner of speaking, in the boat. Someone even knows something about a rope, though Mr. Ashbridge tells us there was no rope. The question is who that someone is, and how they came to know it, and why they have waited 22 years to make use of it. Could it be the other young man, the tenant farmer's son? It could. He is one of 3 possibilities. And the other 2? Holmes smiled slightly. "The other 2, he said, are why we are going to Suffolk. We took the 4 o'clock train from Liverpool Street, and by the time we reached Ipswich the afternoon was already failing into that particular East Anglian dusk which seems to begin in the sky and seep slowly downward into the fields. The fly that Ashbridge had arranged was waiting, driven by a silent man in a heavy coat who took us the 8 miles to Walberswick, along roads that ran first through dark hedges and then, as we neared the coast, through low marshland where the wind moved over the reeds with a sound like slow breathing. We saw the sea before we saw the village. It was very flat and very grey, and there were no lights upon it. The inn was called the Bell, and the landlord, a Mr. True, was expecting us. He gave us rooms at the back, overlooking a small garden and beyond it the shapes of the village against the last of the light. He asked no questions. He brought us a supper of cold beef and bread and a jug of beer, and he left us alone. Holmes ate slowly and said little. When the plates had been cleared, he stood up and put on his coat. "We are going to call upon Mrs. Pollard," he said. "I should prefer that you came." The Ashbridge house stood at the end of a lane half a mile north of the village, set back from the road behind a screen of old yews. It was a large, square, late Georgian house, plain in its architecture and made plainer by the long absence of any decorative addition. There were lights in two of the lower windows. The carriage drive was thick with damp leaves that had not been swept for some days. Holmes did not approach the front door. He went around to the side, to a smaller door set in a brick wall, which I took to be the housekeeper's entrance, and he knocked there. The door opened on the second knock, and a woman of perhaps 60 stood before us holding a candle. She was small and thin, and her hair was iron grey, drawn back severely from a face that had been pretty once and was now merely composed. She looked at Holmes for a long moment without speaking, and then she said, "You will be Mr. Holmes?" "I am. I have been hoping you would come tonight. He will be asleep by now. He sleeps early when he is troubled. Please come into the kitchen, and please speak quietly, because there is one thing I have not told him, and I should prefer that I be the one to tell him when the time comes." We followed her into a stone-flagged kitchen, lit only by the fire and a single oil lamp on the table. She sat us down. She poured tea from a pot that had been kept warm on the hob. She closed the door to the passage, and then she sat opposite us with her hands folded in her lap, and she said quite quietly, "The letters are from me." I confess I had not expected this. Holmes had, I think. He did not look surprised. He looked, rather, as though a piece of evidence he had been holding in reserve had now been placed upon the table by another hand, and he was relieved to be able to discuss it openly. "Tell me," he said. "I will tell you everything," Mrs. Pollard said, "but I must ask you to let me tell it in my own way, because I have not spoken of it in 22 years, and I do not believe I shall be able to speak of it again." She drew a breath. "I came to this house in 1863 as a kitchen maid. I was 19. I rose to be the cook and then the housekeeper, and I have served this family for 31 years. I loved both of those boys as if they had been my own, though I never said so to either of them, because it was not my place. When the trouble came in the summer of '72, I was the one who carried meals up to Mr. Edmund while he was locked in his room. I was the one who emptied the basin and changed the linen. I heard him weep through the door for 3 nights. I heard the master speak to him on the 4th. I heard what the master said, and I heard what Mr. Edmund said, and I heard the silence between them, which was the worst of the 3. And on the 4th night, when they walked down to the boathouse together, I followed them." Holmes was very still. "I followed them," she said, "because I did not trust the master. I had served him 9 years by then, and I knew his temper, and I knew his pride, and I did not believe, God forgive me, I did not believe, that he intended to let Mr. Edmund leave alive. I thought he meant to drown him in the pond and call it an accident. I had decided, if he tried, that I would scream the village awake. I had decided that I would rather lose my place than lose that boy. So I followed them. I kept to the hedges. I came up behind the boathouse from the marsh side, where there is a ditch a person may lie in without being seen, and I watched. "And what did you see?" Holmes asked. "I saw what Mr. Ashbridge has told you. The other young man waiting in the boat, the trunks, the money. I saw the master embrace his younger son for the first and last time in my memory of either of them, and I saw him put a watch into the boy's hand. A watch which was not, by the by, Mr. Ashbridge's grandfather's, though I shall come to that. And I saw the 2 boys row out into the dark toward the ship. And I saw the master stand on the shore until the boat was out of sight, and I saw him sit down in the wet sand and weep, which I had not known him to do before, and have not known him to do since. And then I saw him stand up and walk back to the house and pass within 20 feet of where I lay. And I saw his face as he passed, and I have remembered that face for 22 years. "Why?" said Holmes after a long pause. Have you written the letters?" Mrs. Pollard's hands tightened in her lap. "Because Mr. Edmund is coming home," she said, "and Mr. Ashbridge does not know, and will not believe it if he is simply told, and I have not the courage to tell him plainly. I wrote the letters to prepare him. I wrote them to frighten him into seeking help, which is why I wrote to you 4 days ago, and I wrote them so that by the time Mr. Edmund arrives at the boathouse on the 17th, his brother would already be braced for the impossible. I have made a mistake. I see now that I have made a mistake. I have only frightened him further. I have only made the burden heavier. But I did not know how else to do it. I am 62 years old, Mr. Holmes, and I have kept this house and these 2 men's secrets for the whole of my adult life, and I have done the wrong thing now because I do not have the words to do the right one." "How do you know," Holmes asked, "that Edmund is coming home?" She reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a folded sheet of paper. She passed it across the table. Holmes opened it. I read it over his shoulder. It was a letter. It was written on heavier paper than the others, and the handwriting was different. Looser, older, with a slight tremor in the strokes that suggested either age or illness or both. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier from an address in Buenos Aires. It was 4 pages long. I shall not reproduce all of it. The substance was this: Edmund Ashbridge was alive. He was 51 years old. The young man who had gone with him had died of fever in 1879, and Edmund had lived alone since, working first as a clerk in a shipping office and later as a private tutor of English to the children of wealthy Argentine families. He had never married. He had never returned to England. He had written to Mrs. Pollard once before in 1881, when he learned by chance of his mother's death, and Mrs. Pollard had written back, and they had corresponded perhaps twice a year ever since. Letters which she had hidden in a tin box beneath the floor of her own bedroom, and which neither of the Ashbridges had ever suspected. Now, the letter said, Edmund was ill. He had been told by a Buenos Aires physician that he had perhaps 6 months to live, and probably less. He wished to see his brother once before he died. He had taken passage on a steamer that would land him at Southampton on the 15th of October. He would come to Walberswick. He would wait at the boathouse on the afternoon of the 17th. If his brother did not come, he would understand, and he would go away again, and his brother would never hear from him further. But he wished, if it could be borne, to be seen one last time by the only person left in the world who had ever known him as Edmund. Holmes folded the letter very carefully and laid it on the table, and was silent for a long time. Mrs. Pollard," he said at last. "The watch," she looked up. "You said the watch the master gave to Edmund on the shore was not, in fact, Mr. Ashbridge's grandfather's watch." "It was not." "Whose was it?" "It was the master's own." "His grandfather's." He had it from his grandfather, as Mr. Ashbridge had thought to have it from his. The 2 watches were nearly identical. They were a matched pair, made in Geneva in 1801, given by old Mr. Ashbridge to his 2 grandsons. The master always carried his. He gave it to Mr. Edmund on the shore that night in place of any farewell he could speak aloud. The watch Mr. Ashbridge believed he had given away in the pocket of the coat was still in the house. The master had taken it out of the coat earlier that evening and replaced it with his own. Mr. Ashbridge never knew. I knew, because I had laid out the coat for the boy myself, and I saw the master come into the dressing room and make the exchange. And I did not understand at the time what he was doing, but I understood the next morning when I came down and found Mr. Ashbridge's watch in its usual place on the master's writing desk. And I understood then that the master had wished his younger son to carry something of his into exile, and had wished his elder son to keep what he believed he had given away. It was, I think, the kindest thing the master ever did. He never told either boy of it. He told no one. I did not tell Mr. Ashbridge then, because it was not my place. I have not told him since, because the moment for telling has never come. I have not told him yet because I have been afraid, Mr. Holmes, of what it will do to him to learn that for 22 years he has been mourning a watch that was, in fact, in a drawer in his own study. Holmes did not move for nearly a minute. When he did, it was only to reach out and touch very gently the edge of the letter on the table. "Mrs. Pollard," he said, "I think you have done a great deal of right in your life, and a small wrong in a difficult moment, and I think we may yet repair the small wrong without disturbing the right. May I keep this letter for tonight?" "May I keep this letter for tonight?" "You may. And the 4 letters you sent, there were no others." "There were no others. And no one else knows that Edmund is alive?" "No one in the world, Mr. Holmes. Only myself, and now you and Dr. Watson. And since Friday, when he received my 4th letter, perhaps Mr. Ashbridge has begun to suspect, though he has fought the suspicion because he believes it is impossible." "And the matter of the rope," Holmes said. She bowed her head. "That was the cruelty I should not have written. I am sorry for it. I wrote it because I wished him to feel that someone knew the worst of his story. Knew worse, indeed, than the worst, because there was no rope, as he said. I wrote it to break through. I see now that I broke through the wrong wall. I will answer for that, in my own conscience, for whatever time remains to me." Holmes rose. He took her hand, briefly, a gesture I had seen him make perhaps 4 times in our long acquaintance, and never lightly. "You will not need to answer for it," he said, "to anyone but yourself, and I suspect you have already done so. Good night, Mrs. Pollard. We shall return tomorrow." We walked back to the village in silence. The wind had dropped. The marshes were very quiet. Halfway down the lane, Holmes stopped and looked up at the sky, where a thin moon had appeared above the line of yews, and he said, almost to himself, "Watson, I have rarely been in the presence of so much sustained love performed entirely without permission to call itself by that name." I had no answer for him. We walked the rest of the way to the inn. If you have stayed with me this far, I would ask you, in this quiet stretch before the case resolves, to consider sharing this story with someone you think would value it. A small mention, a comment, a quiet recommendation. These are what allows stories of this kind to find the listeners who want them. Now to the 17th of October, and to the boathouse, and to the question of what was to be done with the truth. Holmes did not sleep well that night. I heard him in the small hours, pacing in his room, and once I heard him stop at the window and stand there for a long time, and once I heard him say something aloud, very quietly, which I could not make out. In the morning he was up before me, dressed, drinking coffee in the parlour, his eyes a little hollowed but otherwise clear. "I have decided," he said, when I came down, "what I shall recommend. Whether it shall be acted upon is, of course, Mr. Ashbridge's choice, and not mine. But I have decided. And? I shall not say yet. I should like first to hear what he says when he has read Edmund's letter. Some decisions belong to the man whose life is being decided. Mine is only to clear the room of false alarms so that he can hear his own answer." We called upon Ashbridge at 10. Mrs. Pollard let us in. She had, I observed, the slightly luminous look of a woman who had not slept either, and who had spent the night doing the quiet hard work of preparing to lose something, perhaps her place, perhaps her secret, perhaps both. She did not meet my eye. She showed us into the study, where Ashbridge was waiting in a leather chair by the window, and she withdrew, and she closed the door behind her with the soft click of a person who had spent her life closing doors softly. Ashbridge looked up. He had not slept either. "Well," he said. Holmes sat down opposite him. He did not waste preliminaries. "Mr. Ashbridge," he said, "the letters were written by Mrs. Pollard. She wrote them to prepare you for the arrival of news. She could not bring herself to tell you plainly. The news is this. Your brother is alive. He is in England, or shortly will be. He landed at Southampton 2 days ago. He is dying. He wishes to see you once on the afternoon of the 17th, at the boathouse, and then to go away again. He has lived in Buenos Aires for 22 years. The young man who went with him died in 1879. Edmund has not married, has not had children, has not, to the best of Mrs. Pollard's knowledge, ever spoken your name aloud in all that time, except in letters to her, which she has kept hidden beneath the floor of her bedroom, and has answered twice a year since 1881. He has carried, all these years, the watch your father gave him on the shore that night, which was not, as you have always supposed, your watch. Your watch. Your father took from the coat before Edmund put it on, and placed in a drawer in this very room where, if I am not very much mistaken, it remains. Mrs. Pollard saw the exchange and did not, at the time, understand it. She understands it now. She has carried that knowledge for 22 years and could not find the moment to give it back to you. She is giving it back to you now through me, because she believes you have a right to know, and because she believes your brother has a right to be seen, and because she is 62 years old and tired, and because she loves both of you and has loved both of you since you were boys, and has loved both of you since you were boys, and has never had any way of saying so. There. That is the whole of it. I have left nothing out. Ashbridge did not speak. He sat in the chair and he looked at Holmes, and then he looked at the window, and then he looked at his own hands, which lay open in his lap. After perhaps a full minute he stood up. He went to the writing desk in the corner of the room. He opened the second drawer on the left. He felt about under some papers. He drew out a small silver watch on a thin chain. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a long time, and then he closed his hand around it and pressed his closed hand against his mouth, and he stood like that, with his back to us, for what felt like a very long while. When he turned around, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "How did she know?" he said. "How did Mrs. Pollard know about the boat? About Edmund, about my father weeping in the sand?" "She followed you that night," Holmes said. "She was afraid for your brother's life. She lay in a ditch by the marsh and watched everything. She has carried that watching with her for as long as you have carried your part of the story. She has never spoken of it. She does not even now wish to be thanked for it. She wishes only to be allowed to keep her place in this house until she dies, which she believes will not be so very long now, and to be permitted at some point to embrace your brother once if he will let her, because she has not seen him since he was 19 years old." Ashbridge sat down again. He still had the watch in his closed fist. He set it on the table between us. "I have been," he said slowly, "the most foolish kind of unhappy. I have been the kind of unhappy a man chooses and tends and waters like a garden. I have been unhappy as a profession, Mr. Holmes. I have been unhappy as though it were my work. And the whole time, there was a woman in my own house who had seen the same night I saw, and remembered it more accurately than I did, and had carried it for me when I could not bear it, and I never knew. "You were not meant to know," Holmes said gently. "That was the kindness of it. She did not love you for thanks. She loved you because she could not help it, and she did not require you to love her back. And Edmund," said Holmes, "is coming tomorrow. The question, Mr. Ashbridge, is whether you wish to be at the boathouse when he arrives." Ashbridge looked at the watch on the table. "Of course I shall be there," he said. And then, after a moment, "What would you have me do, Mr. Holmes?" "I would have you do nothing that I tell you," Holmes said. "I have brought you the facts. The choice of what to do with them belongs to you. I shall tell you, however, what I would not do were I in your place. I would not approach this as a reunion. I would not approach it as a forgiveness. I would not approach it as a settling of accounts. Your brother does not need any of those things from you. He has, by all evidence, made his peace with his exile. What he needs, I think, is only to be looked at. He has lived 22 years among people who did not know his name, and he is dying, and he wishes, once, to stand in front of someone who remembers the boy he was. That is all. If you can give him that, if you can simply stand at the boathouse tomorrow afternoon and look at him, and let him look at you and not require either of you to speak of anything that does not wish to be spoken of, then I think you will have done the only thing that needed doing. The rest will follow, or it will not, as it chooses." Ashbridge was quiet for a long time. "And Mrs. Pollard," he said finally. Mrs. Pollard. Pollard, said Holmes, is in the kitchen, and has not eaten since yesterday morning, and is, I suspect, waiting to be dismissed from her place for the wrong she believes she has done you. You will know what to do. Ashbridge stood up. He picked up the watch from the table. He weighed it in his palm. He looked at it for a moment longer, and then he tucked it into his waistcoat pocket, not the pocket where he had carried, all these years, the watch he believed had belonged to his grandfather, but the other one, the empty one. "Excuse me a moment," he said. He went out of the study. He did not return for nearly 20 minutes. When he did, his eyes were red, but his face was at peace, and Mrs. Pollard was behind him, and she was carrying a tray of fresh tea, and her own eyes were red as well, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them needed to. We took our tea in the study. Mrs. Pollard sat with us at Ashbridge's quiet insistence, which was the first time, I think, in 31 years that she had sat as a guest in any room of that house, and she sat very straight and held her cup with both hands, and did not for some minutes drink from it. Holmes spoke of small things, the weather, the state of the East Anglian railways, the relative merits of Suffolk versus Norfolk shorelines for winter walking. He was, I realized, giving the two of them time. He was filling the room with unimportant words so that the important silences between them could settle without strain. It was, in its way, one of the most considerate things I had ever seen him do. At 1 o'clock we walked down to the boathouse. The boathouse stood at the edge of the mill pond, half a mile from the house, in a stand of alders that had grown up around it in the 22 years since it had last been used. The pond itself was small, perhaps 50 yards across, dark with reflected sky and the shadow of the trees. There was a wooden jetty, much rotted. There was a single rowing boat, upturned on the bank, its bottom green with moss. The boathouse door had once been locked, but the lock was gone now, and the door swung loosely on a single hinge. Holmes did not go inside. He stopped at the edge of the trees with me beside him, and he gestured for Ashbridge to go on alone. "I shall walk down to the village," he said. "Watson and I shall take the 4 o'clock train back to London. We are not needed here tomorrow. Your brother has not asked for us. He has asked for you. Go on, Mr. Ashbridge. We shall not say goodbye, because I expect we shall not meet again, but I shall think of you tomorrow afternoon, and I shall hope very much for both of you." Ashbridge held out his hand. Holmes took it. "How can I thank you?" Ashbridge said. "You cannot, and you need not," said Holmes. "I have done very little. Mrs. Pollard did the difficult work 22 years ago in a ditch by the marsh. I have only relayed it. Go to your brother tomorrow. Look at him. Let him look at you. That is the whole of the case." We walked back to the village together, Holmes and I with Mrs. Pollard between us, because Ashbridge had asked us to see her safely home, and because she had asked, in a small voice, whether she might walk part of the way with us before turning back to the house. She did not speak as we walked. When we reached the edge of the lane that led back up to the house, she stopped and she looked at Holmes, and she said very simply, "Thank you for not making me explain myself to him. I did not know how I should have done it. You have done it for me. I shall be in your debt for the rest of my life, which I do not expect to be long." "Mrs. Pollard," Holmes said, "you owe me nothing. You have shown me what watching looks like when it is done out of love and not out of curiosity, and I think I shall remember that for a long time. Go to your kitchen. Tomorrow at 3, you will have 2 boys back in the same place for the first time in 22 years, and they will both of them need feeding afterward, and that will be your part of it. Good night." She nodded once. She turned and she walked up the lane, and the last we saw of her was a small, upright figure passing under the yews, with the iron-grey hair catching the last of the afternoon light. I asked Holmes on the train back to London what he thought would happen the next afternoon at the boathouse. He looked out of the window for a long time. "I do not know," he said. "I suspect they will not say very much. I suspect Edmund will look older than his brother expects, because Buenos Aires fevers are unkind, and because dying men age in a different rhythm from well ones. I suspect they will sit on the bank for an hour, perhaps 2, and they will speak of small things, and Edmund will hand his brother the watch, and his brother will give back his own, and they will exchange them quietly, as their father exchanged them on the same shore on a different night, and neither of them will need to remark upon what they are doing. I suspect Edmund will refuse to come up to the house. I suspect Mrs. Pollard will walk down to the boathouse before sunset with a basket, and she will see him for the first time in 22 years, and he will see her, and they will not embrace, because that is not the kind of woman she is, but she will pour him tea from a thermos, and he will drink it, and she will look at him, and he will let her, and that will be a kind of homecoming that does not require a house. And then he will go away again. He will go away by the next morning's train. He will return to Southampton, and to the steamer, and to Buenos Aires, and to whatever bed he has there, and he will die there, in the next few months alone, except for whatever neighbors he has made. And he will die having been seen once more by the only two people in the world who remembered him as Edmund. That, I think, is what he came for, and that, I think, is what he will get. It is not a great deal, it is the smallest possible amount, but it is, I am beginning to learn, what most people in the end actually want. Not to be saved, not to be vindicated, not to be made whole again, but only to be looked at once more by someone who knew them when they were young. We rode in silence for some miles. "And the brother who stays behind?" I said at last. "Mr. Ashbridge." "Mr. Ashbridge," said Holmes, "will go on. He will live in that house for some years yet. Mrs. Pollard will die first, I think, and he will mourn her properly, which is to say, privately and without ceremony. He will keep the two watches in the same drawer, and he will wind them both every Sunday morning, because that is the kind of man he is. He will, I expect, write down what happened, not for publication, but for himself, because some truths must be written down before they can be borne. He will not marry. He will not travel. He will not, I think, ever entirely forgive his father, but he will, I think, eventually forgive himself, which is harder and more important. And on some afternoon, perhaps 10 years from now, he will be walking past the boathouse, and he will stop, and he will think of his brother, and the thinking will hurt him less than it used to, and he will understand at last that the lie his family told in 1872 was not, in fact, the lie of his life. The lie of his life was the loneliness he chose afterward. The lie of his life was believing that what had happened to Edmund had to ruin him too. That, Watson, that is the truth that the impossible letters forced into the light. Not who wrote them, not what was in the boat, not what his father did or did not do with any rope. The truth was that a man may spend 22 years mourning a brother who is not dead, and a watch he has not lost, and a love he was never refused, and may call all of that a life, and may believe, until someone shows him otherwise, that there is no other kind of life available to him. That is the truth I came here to find. The rest was machinery. The train moved on through the dark. The lights of small stations passed and were gone. Somewhere behind us on the Suffolk coast, a man was sitting up late in his study with two watches on the table in front of him, learning, perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, that he had been loved in ways he had never thought to look for, and an older woman in a stone-flagged kitchen was sitting by a fire that had burned low, with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the silence of a house she had served for 31 years, and finding, perhaps, that the silence had a different quality than it had before. And somewhere on the road from Ipswich, in a hired carriage, a thin, ill man with grey at his temples and a Buenos Aires fever still in his bones was making his slow way toward a boathouse at the edge of a small pond, carrying nothing with him but a silver watch that had belonged once to a grandfather he had barely known, and the hope, which he had not allowed himself to name, even in his own mind, that someone would still be there to see him when he arrived. He would not be disappointed. There would be two, and that, in the end, was the case of the impossible letters, and the watch in the coat that was not in the coat, and the brother who was not dead, and the housekeeper who had loved two boys for 31 years without permission to say so, and the man who had mistaken his own loneliness for his fate. The mystery was solved. The pain, as Holmes had said at the beginning, was not. Pain of that kind is rarely solved. It is only on the best days sit down for a moment and looked at honestly, and then picked up again and carried differently, lighter by some small fraction, by the knowledge that one had not, after all, been carrying it entirely alone. I think of them sometimes, the three of them on that Suffolk shore. I think of them in October light. I think of the watch passing from one hand to another, and of the tea in the basket, and of the small, upright figure of Mrs. Pollard walking down through the alders with the last of the afternoon behind her. I think of how seldom in any life we are given the chance to be seen by someone who knew us before we became whatever we have become, and of how, when that chance comes, it is usually too late or too brief, or arrives in a form we did not expect and cannot quite accept. And I think that Edmund Ashbridge, dying in Buenos Aires some months later, for he did die, as he had said he would, and Mrs. Pollard received the letter from his neighbor in the following spring, must have considered himself, all things weighed, a fortunate man, not because the lie of his exile had been undone. It had not. He had still gone away. He had still spent 22 years among strangers. He had still died far from any country he could call his own. But he had been looked at once more by the two people in the world who remembered his name. And for some people, in some lives, that small grace turns out to be the whole of what was wanted, and the whole of what, in the end, can be given.